Everyone, and welcome to the Document Object Model section of the course. In this section, we're going to be learning about the Document Object Model, or DOM, and the Document Object Model is going to allow us to interface our JavaScript code to directly interact with HTML and CSS on a web page. So far, we've already learned and have a pretty good understanding of the three main front-end technologies. That's HTML for the website content, CSS for the styling of that content, and then JavaScript, which can interact with the website, HTML and CSS, and actually manipulate what you see on the page. What we actually don't know how to do yet is how to really connect that JavaScript with HTML and CSS. How can we use JavaScript to directly interact with the HTML and CSS and change what the user is actually seeing? Well, browsers will construct the document object model, which basically means storing all the HTML tags as JavaScript objects. And let me show you a very simple example of this. Imagine I have some very basic HTML over here on the left-hand side. I have a head, a title, which is just my title, and in the body, I have a heading 1, and then an anchor tag website link. And then right below that on the left-hand side is what this would look like in the browser. It would just be a heading and then some link text there. When I upload this in my browser, what happens is my browser creates this document object model. And we can already see how this looks like a JavaScript object. So I have the root element, the HTML, the head, the title, the text, and I can actually grab things from this document object model using JavaScript. So we can see the DOM or DOM of any website. So you can go to a website and in the console type document to see the actual document object model. And we're going to be doing that in this lecture later on. And that will return the HTML text of the page. To see the actual objects, you want to use console.dir and then pass in document. This document object model will allow us to use JavaScript to actually interact with the web page and affect the HTML and CSS on the web page. Now keep in mind, the document object model is enormous. It has tons of properties. It's a huge object, but most developers won't use all the properties, not even close to all the properties. But we're going to be covering the most common objects used, and I want you to be prepared for the unknown. When you first see the document object model, it's going to seem really intimidating, and there's all these properties, and you'll feel like there's no way you'll ever be able to memorize all of them. And that's not really the point. You don't have to memorize all of them. What you have to do is have an understanding of how it works. That way, when you need something that you haven't encountered yet, you have the capability to reference it on your own and look for help on your own. So let's continue by actually exploring this idea in the browser. And afterwards, in the next lecture, we're going to go through an example of using JavaScript with the document object model. So let me hop over to my browser and kind of show you realistically what the heck I've been talking about. Okay, so here I am at Instagram.com. You can really choose any website for this exercise or this example. And hopefully now you can kind of see, based off just what Instagram looks like at this moment in time, you probably already have the abilities to mock up something that looks pretty similar to this just with HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap. You already know how to create forms, how to create nav bars, etc. But let's continue on and talk about the actual thing we came here for, which is the document object model. What you can do, and you can do this on any page, doesn't have to be Instagram, right-click, then hit Inspect, and then come to the console. And what you're going to do is just clear the console. You may have some messages here depending on what website you're visiting. Don't worry about them, just clear the console. And let's explore the document object model. Now, if I just type in the variable document and hit enter, I will actually get as an output the HTML that's on this page. So I can see here there's a body, and I can keep expanding this to end up seeing some scripts. Maybe I want to see these divs, etc. Eventually I'll see the forms, but that's not actually what we want to see. What we want to see is this entire document, so all the HTML and its properties, as a JavaScript object. And to do that, I can say console.dir and then pass in the document. I'll hit enter, and now we see document, and if I expand it, I get what looks like and basically is a JavaScript object, where I have all these various properties and their values. And here, I can actually then, using JavaScript, grab properties from this web page and then edit their values to actually create changes that appear to the user on the front end. And that's basically the idea behind the document object model. This is what's going to allow you to use JavaScript to actually manipulate what the user sees on the web page. And this is going to be the big leap forward for us to end our understanding of how the front end actually works. So far we have all the puzzle pieces, but we haven't really put them together. The document object model is what's going to allow us to put them all together and actually see how the front end fully collaborates with JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, making that powerful front end stack really shine and really work. Okay, so that's all I want to cover for this lecture. In the next lecture, we're actually going to show you an example of how you can affect this document object model using JavaScript. All right, Thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture. And welcome to Part 1, DOM Interaction. And in this lecture, we'll use JavaScript to actually interact with DOM elements. So as I mentioned, we're going to begin to see examples of how we can actually grab HTML elements from the document object model. And these HTML elements are the properties of that JavaScript object, which is the document. So we're going to be covering how to grab large groups of elements, like the entire body of the HTML, or just the head of the HTML, and then we'll focus on grabbing specific HTML items. Maybe you're interested in just grabbing a certain class or a certain ID. And in future lectures, we'll show you how you can interact with those objects. So right now, we're just focusing on grabbing those elements themselves. In future lectures, we'll show you how to change their colors or affect their properties somehow. Okay, here are some important document attributes. So you can call a document and say .url, body, .head, .links. So .url, that's actually going to return the actual URL of the website. .body, that's everything inside the body. It's going to return the HTML of the entire body. Document.head is going to return everything that's in the head of the page. And then .links, those are all the links that are on the page. And there are many methods for grabbing specific elements from the document object model. And these methods are usually pretty self-explanatory, except for those last two. But first off, let's start off with getElementById. So getElementById, that returns an element with whatever ID you pass in. So imagine that your HTML has a specific ID that you clarified earlier when creating the HTML. Saying document.getElementById will actually grab those elements. Well, usually ID is a single element by the ID you pass in. Then you can get element by class name, so pass in a class, and it'll return a list of all items belonging to that class. Then document.getElementByTagName returns a list of all elements of a certain tag. So if you want everything that has an anchor tag, you can do that as well. Then we have querySelector and querySelectorAll. They're a little more new than the previous three, but they're still pretty well used now, depending when you actually are viewing this. But the querySelector returns the first object matching the CSS style selector. And then querySelectorAll returns all objects matching the CSS style selector. And we're going to show examples of querySelector and querySelectorAll since we're going to be using those a lot. So again, the first three there are pretty self-explanatory, but the querySelector can accept any CSS style selector. So you can use things like the hashtag to clarify it's an ID, or the dot if you want a class. So basically anything for CSS that you used as a style selector, you can just pass it directly into querySelector. And if that's unclear to you now, don't worry, I'll show plenty of examples as we move along. But again, the difference between querySelector and then querySelectorAll is that querySelectorAll returns a list of all matches, querySelector just returns the first match. Okay, the relevant files for this particular lecture are part 1, mainpage.html, and part 1, colorchanger.js. We're going to start off by disconnecting the HTML file from colorchanger.javascript and exploring it a bit manually. Then we're going to code out a complex example, which is actually going to be colorchanger.js. All right, let's explore these various methods and get started by opening up those two files in the editor and linking them to our browser. Okay, so here I have part 1 main page HTML open in my editor, and I also have it open in my browser on the right-hand side. And something you notice that's probably pretty interesting to you is that the heading 1 is randomly changing color. And you're probably wondering, how the heck is that happening? Well, in this lecture, we're going to actually code out the example that creates that effect in order to begin explaining how we can grab elements from the document object model and then affect them using JavaScript. But what we're going to do to start off is in part 1 underscore main underscore page, scroll all the way down, and you should see the connection to the part 1 colorchanger.js script. What I want you to do is comment this out to begin with, save it, and then refresh the connection page, and you should see it just turn to black. What we're going to be focusing on right now is grabbing those common document attributes and then showing the various methods we have to grab HTML elements. So let's get started on that. I'm going to expand my browser and start off by exploring these points right here, which we also covered in the slide. So what's nice about this HTML file is it's basically notes for what we're going to be doing. I'm going to right-click, hit Inspect, and then open up the console. And your console is probably not going to be as zoomed in as mine because this is just for readability. Let's show you how to grab important document attributes. If you want to grab the actual URL of the website, you pass document and then all caps URL, and this returns the URL of the website. In my case, stuff is being hosted locally, so I just get the file location. If you want to grab everything inside the body, you can say document.body, hit enter, and then you can see here we actually have HTML code, which is the entire body. And if we want to grab everything in the head, we just say document.head. And notice these are attributes, not methods, so I'm not putting any closed parentheses after them. We can expand this and check out the head of the document. And finally, if there are links on the page, in our case, there are no links, but if you wanted to get a list of all the links, you would use document.links. Here again, an empty list because there are no links on that page. Now let's move on to some of these more important methods. Well, not more important, but probably more useful. The getElementById and then the querySelector family of elements. Let's clear this console. If we want to actually grab elements by ID, we can use the getElementById method. But first off, let's go back to the HTML and actually give an ID to one of these HTML elements. So let's give this list item, the very first list item that says document.url, I'm going to give it an ID of pickme. We'll save it. And then let's also add a class in here somewhere. Let's give both unordered lists a class of myUL, and we'll also give this one a class equal to myUL. So myUL, there's the two classes, and then we have one instance of the pickme ID. I'm going to save this, and then I'll actually refresh my page to make sure those changes are loaded up here. And then let's show you how we can grab these elements with the document object model using the methods we just described. So I expand this again, and then what I'm going to be doing here is off the document, I will say getElementById, and then I pass in the ID I want. And remember, my ID, if I look back at the actual HTML, is just pickme. So let's type that in. Pickme. We hit enter, and we see here the HTML. It's a list item, has ID pickme, and then it says document URL. This is the actual URL of the website. So if we come back up here, it's actually highlighted when I hover over it, which is kind of nice that Chrome's kind of helping you out here and pointing out what you actually grabbed. So that's how you can grab an element by ID. And then if we want to grab by a class name, we say document.getElements by class name. We can see it kind of auto-completes there. And remember the class name we created was myUL. And then we get back what is essentially kind of acting like a list or an array. It's not quite a JavaScript array, so keep that in mind, but it acts very similar to it. If we expand this, we see we have essentially this HTML collection of these two unordered lists, and those have a bunch of properties themselves. And later on, we're going to see how we can actually grab those properties and affect them. But I'm going to collapse this for right now. So we were able to grab elements by ID, elements by class name, and if you wanted to grab elements by the tag name, you probably guessed that already, but you just say document.getElements by tag name, and then input the tag you want. So if I want all the list elements, I just pass in li, and then those are all the list elements, and you're also given awareness that one of these has an ID attached to it. Now let's talk about querySelector and querySelector all, which are not quite as obvious as the ID, class name, and tag name methods. QuerySelector is really similar as far as grabbing HTML elements, but what differentiates it from the by ID, by class name, or by tag name is it actually uses the CSS style selector. So it saves you a bunch of time. And let me show you what I actually mean by CSS style selector. If I clear this, I'm going to grab my document, say query selector, and then what I'm going to actually do here is pass in a query selector for a CSS selector. So I will say hashtag pickme. I hit enter and I get the ID pickme. So just like you would if you had a CSS file attached to the HTML and you wanted to affect an ID, you would call the CSS style selector, hashtag for the ID, and then the ID name. The query selector actually allows you to grab things by that CSS style selector. So that makes your life a lot easier, and now you don't actually need to even use by ID, by class name, by tag name. You can do everything with query selector and query selector all. So let's imagine I wanted to grab all the li tags. Well, I could just say document query selector. Well, let's say query selector all. I pass in li, hit enter, and I get the exact same thing as if I had done it by class name, or excuse me, if I had done it by tag name. If I wanted to do it by class name, well, I would say document, and then query selector all. Oops, not query command. Query selector all, and then pass in the class. But remember, for CSS style selectors, a class has a dot, So we say dot and then the class name, which was myUL, hit enter, and we get back the exact same thing we previously got when we said get elements by class name. And hopefully now you get the idea that all you have to do with query selector and query selector all is pass in the actual CSS selector tag. And that saves you a lot of time for typing, and it just makes the whole process a little more clear. And as I previously mentioned, the difference between query selector and query selector all is that query selector all returns all the objects matching the CSS style selector. Query selector just returns the very first object. So for instance here, I see document query selector all dot myUL returns 2 instances of that class. Let's say I just wanted to grab the first one. Well, then I could say document query selector dot myUL, and that will just return the very first instance of this class on the HTML page. So that's the main difference between query selector all and query selector. Okay, so we've covered how to actually grab the objects. Let's show a very simple example of how to interact with those objects and change their properties. Let's imagine I want to change the color of the header. Well, the first thing I need to do is actually grab the header. So I will create a variable. We'll call it myHeader, and I'm going to set it equal to document.querySelector, and then pass in the CSS selector. In this case, it's just the very first instance of heading 1. I hit enter, and if I check out my header, I get back h1. It has some sort of style call saying it's color black. Most likely yours just says this is the header. I've already manipulated it before, but here we have the header, the HTML. Now let's change the actual color. So in this case, I need to say myHeader dot, and you'll notice we have a ton of attributes available for this header object or heading object. First one we're going to mess around with is style. So then I will say style, and as you scroll down, you're going to see a lot of the things we learned about during the CSS section of the course. Things like the border width, things like the color, other things such as font properties, height, etc., margin. But let's keep it simple. Let's just grab the color. And if I want to change it, all I have to do is set this equal to some other value. So for instance, let's change it to red. I hit enter here, and now up here on the website page, I can see this is the header has been turned red. And that's the basic fundamental idea of actually grabbing things from the document object model and then affecting them in some manner, changing their properties. And that's really how the front end stack works. You have HTML and CSS, and then JavaScript can use the DOM to go in and grab things. And later on, we'll show you much more advanced methods, such as performing those actions or interactions on clicks or when you hover over text. But the fundamental idea behind everything is that you're grabbing things from the document object model and then interacting with them or changing their properties in some way. Now let's actually show you how we can create that random color generator in the JavaScript file. So I will come back here to this HTML page right here, and all the way down I'm going to connect it back to part 1 color changer script, save it, and if you come over to the JavaScript, so let's expand this a little more so we can get a good look at it. We have some examples of what we just did, grabbing that header, changing that style color, but let's show you how we could actually create the random color changing. And I'm just going to walk through this code because it's essentially a little too complex for us at this moment in time, but later on you can always come back to this and you probably will understand it completely. In fact, right now, you should know enough JavaScript that you're able to read this. But let's say I wanted to get a random color function. So every second I change something to a random color. Well, the first thing I need to do is figure out how do I get a random color using JavaScript. And for that, you will probably use Stack Overflow. And I actually linked the Stack Overflow that answers that question. So for me personally, I'm not dealing with JavaScript as often as I would like. I'm usually dealing with Python more. So if I'm forgetful of how to actually grab a random color, I would start Google searching. And if you Google search this, you'll eventually come up to this Stack Overflow link, which is right here for you. And someone has been nice enough to place the actual answer of a random color generator in JavaScript. So we can just copy and paste this code and put it in our script. And basically what this is doing, we can see we have letters, we have some hex code, and it's saying for I is equal to 0 all the way I less than 6, it's going to somehow grab a series of random letters and then put them in front of the hashtag, and that's making hex codes for us, and it's returning that hex code. So all this is doing is it's making random hex codes for us. So then we create this simple function for clarity. We say function change header color, we say the color input is get random color. So again, that's just returning a random hex code. And then I'm saying header.style.color is equal to the color input, that random hex code that we just created. And then I'm going to perform that action over a set of intervals. And this is some JavaScript code for actually performing some JavaScript function over a set of certain intervals, in our case, milliseconds. So all I'm saying here is every 500 milliseconds, call this function right here, change header color. So now if I save this and I come back to my actual page, over here, my main page, and I refresh, I see now that I'm changing the color randomly every half a second. And that's the main fundamental idea behind the document object model and the interaction. Now what we're going to cover is many more methods and many more details about this process and how to go through it in future lectures in this section of the course. And then later on we'll show you jQuery, which kind of also simplifies this entire process for you. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. And welcome to Part 2, Content Interaction. In this lecture, we're going to be seeing more examples of how to interact with the HTML from the document object model. We'll show you how to do things such as change text, change the HTML code, and affect the attributes. The relevant files for this lecture are part 2 content.html, that's the actual file I'll have open in my browser, and part 2 interact.js, that's just a copy of all the commands I'll be inputting into the console. Let's get started by opening up part 2 content.html in our browser. Alright, so here I have the HTML document open, and what we're going to be doing is showing you how to change the text, HTML content, and attributes with the actual DOM. So imagine that you've used query selector to actually select an element from the document object model, and you call that variable myVariable. Then you could use some of these methods to actually affect it or interact with it. So we could call myVariable.textContent, and that returns the actual text. So you could set that equal to some new text if you wanted to change the text of whatever HTML variable you were messing around with. Or if you wanted to actually affect the HTML and have effects on things such as the strong tags or the emphasis tags, you could do something like .inner HTML, and that returns the actual HTML. If you want to affect attributes or interact with them, you can use the .get attribute or the .set attribute. Now let's show some actual examples of all of this. Here I'm going to be actually manipulating this page that I'm looking at right now. So again, to edit styles, we've already seen we can use the .style tag. Now we're going to show you how to edit actual HTML or text or attributes. So I'm going to grab this paragraph right here that I'm highlighting. Let's show you how we can do that. I'll create a new variable. Let's call it P for paragraph, although you can probably call it whatever you want. We'll say document.querySelector, and I'm going to grab the paragraph tag here. And if I type paragraph, I can see I have the paragraph tag, and I can expand this to actually view everything that says to edit styles. I see there's a link here to attributes. So if I click on this attributes link, it takes me to google.com. So here I see Google opening up. Now what I actually want to do is change some of the text here. So I will clear this, and I'm going to say p.textContent, and now I can set it equal to anything that I want. So let's call it all new text, and then hit enter. And now I see that I've actually changed the text here. So it says new text. Now imagine that I wanted to make the text bold. Well, what I can't do is this. I'm not able to say text content and then pass in a strong tag and say something like I'm bold, closing strong tag. The reason I'm not able to do something like this, and we'll see why what happens, is because I'm just grabbing the text content. If I actually want to affect the HTML, I need to grab the inner HTML. So I will say p.innerHTML, and I'm going to set it equal now to what I previously did. So let's grab this and just copy and paste it. In fact, I'll grab it with the quotes. And then hit enter, and I can see now my paragraph is in bold. It says I'm bold. And I can see that it's darker. So that's the difference between text content and inner HTML. If you want to actually pass in HTML tags when you're interacting with the HTML, then you're going to need to call inner HTML instead of just text content. Now let's show you how you can get attributes and set attributes. So if we look down here, there's a link to Facebook all the way here at the end. So if I click on this, it takes me to Facebook and says I'm another header with a special ID. So don't worry about that for right now. Instead, what I'm going to do is clear my console, and I'm going to grab everything with the special ID. So I'll say var special is equal to document query selector. And remember, it's an ID, so I say hashtag since I can use CSS style selectors, and then say special. And again, you would, whoops. There we go. And again, you would have to know that there's a special ID in the HTML. Here it's actually telling me that, but you'd have to actually reference the HTML to know this. So it's not like special is just some sort of normal ID. So here I can see now if I type in special, I have heading 4, ID is equal to special. It says I'm another header. Looks like the header has emphasis. And then I also see href to facebook.com. Now, how can I actually change this? Well, I can say this. I can say variable special a is equal to, and then I'm going to grab special dot, and I will do a query selector on that. I will say query selector, grab the anchor tag. Hit enter, and now when I see special a, I see that I've only grabbed the anchor tag. So I can see that I can actually call multiple query selectors until I actually find or get what I'm looking for. So here's the href, it goes to facebook.com. If I actually want to get just the attribute, I can say special a dot get attribute, and then I can grab the href itself if I only want to grab that link. If I want to change the attribute, then I need to use the set attribute. So I need to say special a dot set attribute, and this takes in 2 arguments. The attribute that you want to change, and then the actual value you want to change it to. So we'll say HTTPS, and let's change it to something like Amazon.com. We hit enter, and now we've actually changed this to Amazon.com. So if I click on this link, instead of Facebook, we see that it takes me to Amazon. All right, so that's the general way of using these 4 methods. Remember, text content is just for returning the text. Inner HTML returns the actual HTML. And if you want to affect attributes within something, you need to do it with set attribute. If you want to just grab the attribute, you can say get attribute. If you want to change it, instead of doing just an equal sign like we did earlier, you use set attribute, where the first argument is the actual attribute, and the second argument is what you want to set it to. All right, thanks everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to post to the Q&A forums, and I'm happy to help you out. I'll see you at the next lecture. And welcome back to part 3, Document Object Model Events. And we're going to learn how to use JavaScript to trigger on events. So we don't always want to have to specify beforehand how to interact with the document object model. It's unrealistic that we're going to be editing the console every single time, or that we'll magically know in the JavaScript what we want to actually interact with. Many times we only want the interaction to occur on a particular event, such as a click or a hover, and that's what you've been used to when you visit real websites. What we want to do is achieve this sort of effect by adding what's known as an event listener. And the JavaScript will be listening for an event to occur and then execute a function when it happens. Let me show you some example code so you can get a better idea of what I mean by this. Imagine we want to listen for an event. Well, the basic form looks like this. It's my variable, whatever variable you happen to have grabbed from the document object model. Then you say .add event listener, you call that method, and then you pass in a particular event and a function. So for example, let's say we grab the head of the document, or heading 1, by saying document.querySelector h1. Then, off of that variable, we would say add event listener, pass in an event name, and an example event name is such as click, and then comma, we would pass in some function, such as the change color function that we've seen earlier. And that's the basic form of event listeners. You pass in a particular event name, and then you pass in a function that you've created, or a built-in function that you want to have happen upon the event. So there are many, many possible events. Just a few of them are things such as clicks, hovers, double clicks, dragging, and there's much more. What I recommend is if you're really interested in all these events, then check out this link right here. You can just Google search developer Mozilla JavaScript events, or excuse me, document object model events, and it'll probably take you to this page, but there's the link if you want it. We're just going to show you a few of the most useful events. So let's explore these events. I'm going to hop over to my editor and browser and show you how you can make the interaction functions occur upon a particular event. Okay, so I have my editor open, and I also have a blank HTML file called main.html, and And then I also have a blank JavaScript file called myscript.js. And I'm going to grab the full path to main HTML and then go to it in my browser on the right-hand side. And it's blank right now. So let's put in some HTML content. That way we can, in the future, grab it using document object model. So right now in the body, I'm going to add in 3 h1 tags. The first h1 tag is going to say, hover over me. And we're going to give it an ID equal to 1. Then the second h1 tag, it's going to say, click me, and we'll give it an ID tag of 2. And then heading 1, it gets an ID tag, you've probably guessed it, of 3. And it's going to say, double click me. We're going to save that. Let's refresh our page. And here we see hover over me, click me, and double click me. And now let's connect it using the script tag. So I will say script, and then src, the source is equal to myscript.js. Save that. And now let's hop over to myscript.js and show you how we can add in event listeners. So the first thing we need to do is actually grab the document object model variables that we want. So the first one we'll call head1, and I want that to be document.querySelector. And then I can just pass in hashtag 1. And I'm going to copy and paste this line, since the next two are going to look really similar. So instead of 1, we'll say the ID 2. And then instead of 1 there, we'll say 3. And then coming all the way over here, we'll change this as well to head 3 and then head 2. So we have everything. And just to make sure it's all connected, I'm going to say console.log connected. Let's save this, refresh our page, and here I see console.log connected. So everything's working well. I can get rid of this now. And let's show you how to add a basic event listener. First thing we need to do after grabbing from the document object model is grab the variable, and then you say dot, and you add an event listener, and make sure your spelling and capitalization is correct here. So add event listener. And one event you may want to do is what's known as a mouse over. And that's essentially whenever your mouse is hovering over some object or some HTML attribute, then the function will take place. So the keyword here is mouse over. That's the event name. And then we pass a function, curly brackets, and then hit enter. And here is where we can define the function. What do we want to actually happen when we call mouse over? So let's have the text change. So I will say head 1 dot text content is equal to mouse currently over. Let's save that. We'll refresh our page. And now you'll notice when I hover my mouse over this, one time it says mouse currently over, and then it stops. So that's the very basic of mouse over. Let's add one more change to this. We'll also change the color. We'll say head1 style.color and set that equal to something really obvious like red. Save it, refresh the page, and then I see hover over me, and as I come in and I hover over, it says mouse currently over, and then I can't change it back. So how do we actually make it so that once my mouse comes off of it, it reverts back? Well, the way we can do that is with the mouse out event. So again, I grab head1, I add an event listener, and then I say mouse out, pass in a function call here. And for this function call, we will have it say head1, and we will call the text content of head1 to be equal to what it originally said. And what it originally said was something like hover over me. And then let's change it back to its original color. And its original color was black. Okay. So here we can save this, and let's try this again. And now we should see the change. If I'm saying mouse currently over, I pull my mouse off, and it says hover over me. And now I can see it turn on and off as my mouse hovers over it. So pretty cool. You can kind of play around with this a lot. But that's the very basics of adding an event listener. Again, you're grabbing something from the document object model, probably using query selector. In the next section, we'll learn how to do this with jQuery. And then you say add event listener, whatever event you're looking for. You can check out that link for a huge list of event names. And then you pass in the function and what you actually want to occur in that function when this event takes place. All right, so that's a very basic event listener. Let's show you some more basic ones, such as on clicks. I'll grab head2, add an event listener, and for a click, it's just that keyword, click. Then I will call function, and the function I want here is, let's change it upon click. So we'll say head2, text content, we'll have it say clicked on, and we'll also change its color just so it's really obvious. Head2, style.color, and I'm going to change that to be blue. Let's save it, refresh over here, and right now as I hover over this thing, it changes. If I click on the click me, I can see it says clicked on. All right, pretty cool so far. Finally, let's show you how we can do a double click. Head2, add event listener. The keyword for this one is DBL click, that stands for double click. Again, we have the function call, curly brackets, and then whatever you want happens to any really HTML element on the page, we'll do it to, whoops, this should actually be head3, not head2, my apologies. And then let's change the text content, and we'll say I was double clicked. And then we'll say head3. Let's also change the color, and we'll set it equal to red. Save it, refresh our page, and we can see here my hover is working. I'm going to click this, it's got clicked on, and then if I only click once, you can't really see it or hear it, but I'm only clicking once here. It's only until I double click that I see I was double clicked. All right, so that's the basics of using events with JavaScript and the document object model. Coming up next, we're going to be doing a walkthrough of a very simple game project, a very, very simple tic-tac-toe model. It's not even going to be a full game of tic-tac-toe, just to get an idea of what all of this would look like in a larger front-end stack project. Thanks, everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture. To Part 4, the game project of the document object model section of the course. It's time to actually get some practice with the document object model and using JavaScript to interact with it. We're going to be creating a very simple tic-tac-toe game interface, and you have two options on the approach for this project. Your first option is to try to replicate the game completely on your own. So at the end of this lecture, we'll show you what the game looks like, and you can try to replicate the game on your own in the editor and try your best. The second option is to just follow along with the solution lecture that comes after this one for a code-along session. I personally recommend you try at least once completely on your own to get some practice of seeing something and then trying to replicate it on your own. That's a really great skill to have. But if you're still not that comfortable with the material, that's no problem. Feel free to just move on to the solution lecture and have a code-along session until you feel more comfortable manipulating the document object model. Let's start by seeing what the final game actually looks like. Okay, here I have the game open, and this is essentially what it looks like. You can see I'm using some Bootstrap here for the Jumbotron, and I have a little button that says Restart. And all this is, it's a table, and it's a 3x3 table, but you notice when I actually click on this, I see an X, and if I click on another square, I get an O if I click twice, so it goes X, O, blank. And this is a very, very simple project, so you'll notice if I get 3 in a row, there's no announcement of any sort of win. All I want to focus on here is just manipulating the document object model. So it's a very, very simple project as far as any logic. The only logic that's being done here is that when I click on something, it'll end up cycling through the X, the O, and the blank. And this is just a table with some CSS styling to make it look like a tic-tac-toe board. And then if I click Restart here, it just refreshes and clears everything out. That's all you have to do for the tic-tac-toe project. Again, I recommend that you at least try this completely on your own to replicate something that looks like this. Or if you still don't feel that comfortable, just head on over to the next lecture where I'm going to be coding through the solution. All right, thanks everyone. Best of luck, I'll see you at the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to be coding out the solutions for the game project, that tic-tac-toe project from the previous lecture. Hopefully you had a chance to attempt it on your own, but if not, feel free to code along with me right now. I'm going to hop over to my editor and browser to get started. Okay, here I am at my editor, and here's the browser, and I have 3 files open, an empty HTML file, an empty CSS file, and an empty JavaScript file. So we're ready to really tackle the front end and see its capabilities with this little project of ours. Let's start off by creating the HTML file and filling out the actual content. Then we'll style it, and then we'll actually add the interactivity with JavaScript. Going to type HTML there. Just to set it up, we have tic-tac-toe, and let's actually link our CSS file. So I'm going to link right now to my CSS file, which I've just called game.css, and then I'm also going to link to Bootstrap. That way I can use the Jumbotron later. All you have to do that is come to getbootstrap.com, and then I can just scroll down here and grab the latest compiled and minified CSS, copy and paste that line into my file, and let's check that we're ready to go by just putting a heading in here saying connected. Let's make sure that font looks good. Refresh our page, and here we have connected in Bootstrap font, so we know we're good to go. Okay, so far my links are okay, and I also want to link to my script. Let's just do that over here at the bottom. So all the way at the bottom, I'm going to call script, and we're going to make the source equal to my script, which is called myscript.js. We'll save that. And to verify that's connected, I'm going to do a console log that says connected. Save that. We'll refresh this page, and then let's inspect view the console. Let me expand this just so we can see it. And it says connected, so we're good to go there. Fantastic. Now we need to create some HTML content to actually create the board. Let's comment this out, and then coming back to main, let's expand this. First thing we wanted to do is, since we're dealing with Bootstrap, create a div tag that contains the class container. So this will have the container class, and then inside of this, I'm going to create the Jumbotron. Then we'll have a heading inside this Jumbotron that says, welcome to tic-tac-toe, tic-tac-toe. And we can put a paragraph in here if we want. It says, get ready to play. Let's save this and refresh, make sure it actually looks good. Okay, welcome tic-tac-toe, get ready to play. And then finally, let's add a button. Remember, we had that restart button. So I will call a button tag, and then it will have the type button. The name button's fine, but let's give it a class. In the class, we are going to just reference Bootstrap for this. So I wouldn't expect you to have this memorized. I would expect you to reference the documentation. But the class I chose was BTN, and then I also added the BTN primary to it. And then I wanted to make the button large, so I added BTN LG. So basically what's happening here is this class tells it it's a Bootstrap button. This tells it it's a primary Bootstrap button, so that takes care of the coloring. And this takes care of the sizing, BTN large. Let me save this, and let's also add what we want the button to say. So let's have it say something like restart. And we could put this on multiple lines if we wanted to. I'll just keep it on one line. I'm pretty zoomed in right now, but let's refresh. And here we have restart. I can click on it, nothing's happening, but it's all working the way we want it to so far. Now, let's continue on. Something to think about at this stage is I will probably want to reference this button later on in my JavaScript. Since it's the only button on the page, let's just give it an ID. We could also call it by its tag, but I like calling things by their ID. So let's give it the ID B, so I can call it later. And what we're going to do is add in the table that's going to represent our board. We're going to add in the table, and then we'll have to style it to actually make it look like a board. So let's continue on with that. I'm going to put this inside of the container, but outside of the Jumbotron. So let's expand that. So here we are now inside the container, but outside the Jumbotron. I'm going to call a table, and I'm going to say my table has align equal to center. And then inside of this, I have 3 table rows. So we'll say tr, and inside of each row, there's going to be 3 cells. So td, and we'll leave them blank for now. td, leave that one blank, and then td, leave that one blank. And now let's do this 2 more times. You can just copy and paste. And if we save this, we should have our table right here. But you'll notice there's actually nothing showing up, and that's because we have no styling attached to this table. So let's come over to the .css script and actually give some styling so we make sure that we're actually seeing this table. I'm going to give styling to the actual table cells, the TD, and let's give it a height of 150 pixels. And these values are pretty arbitrary, so you could have put whatever you wanted. I'll also give it a width of 150 pixels, so they're squares. I'm going to text align center, and the reason for that is when I put an X or an O inside of the actual cell, I want it to be center aligned. And then let's give it a border. This will allow us to see it. We'll say 5 pixel solid black border. And then let's give it a font size of 100 pixels. And again, this font size refers to when I'm actually going to be inputting X's and O's. So let's save this. We'll refresh over here. And now I see my tic-tac-toe board. Great. And let's practice manually putting in an X over here. So let's put an X into the very first table cell, save this, refresh, and there's my X. And it's text aligned centered, which is exactly what we wanted. Great. Hopefully you were able to get this far with very few difficulties. I know it may look kind of daunting when you see just what the browser, but on the HTML and CSS side, it's definitely everything that we've done before, and it's pretty straightforward. Now, what might not be so straightforward, especially since we were just learning it, is the actual JavaScript code to manipulate the document object model to play the game. So let's get started on that. I'm going to have a few sections. I'll have the restart game button. Then I'll have some sort of section that grabs all the squares. Then I also want some sort of function that can clear all the squares. And then I want to create a function that will check the square marker. So something like check the square marker, so check if it's an X or an O. And then finally, I want some sort of for loop to add event listeners to all the squares. Okay, so those are the main tasks we have to do in our JavaScript code. And I'm going to approach this in the next lecture. That way you can spend some time to review the HTML and CSS. In the next lecture, we'll actually code out all this JavaScript. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you there. Everybody, I'm here right where we left off last time with the JavaScript file open. Again, we defined the sections of code that we actually have to code out, so let's get started with just the restart game button. First off, let's make the variable. Let's grab it from the document object model. I'm going to say, call it restart, and it's going to be equal to the document, and then I will use query selector on the document, and I'm going to grab the tag that I made for it, or excuse me, not the tag, the ID. I could have also done a button tag since it's the only button on here, but let's just do hashtag B, because if I look at my main file here, I gave it the ID B, so that looks good. Then I want to grab all the squares. So I'll create a variable called squares, and then I'll set that equal to document query selector, query selector, and let's have it be query selector all because I want all the squares, and that's going to be the same as all the table cells. And something to note here is that I spelled squares wrong, so there we go. Okay, so there's all the squares, and then I want to create a function that clears all the squares. So how do we do that? Well, I'll say function, and let's give this function the name clearBoard. And for this, I'll have a for loop that goes for every cell or everything in the squares, and then it just makes the content blank. So let me show you what I mean by that. We'll say for, and the array we're going to be playing with is the squares array. And then I can click to deactivate that. So from I equals 0 all the way to I less than squares.length, increasing, I'm going to grab the current cell and then change its text content to be blank. And that's all I'm doing to clear the board. So what is this actually doing? Well, remember, query selector all is going to return all the table cells. And that I have saved as squares. And then we're going to have a function called clearBoard that basically loops through everything in Square, so every element in what is basically acting like an array. It's not quite a JavaScript array, but it's acting like one. And then we can just say squares I dot text content and then set that equal to blank. Let's test to see that this clear board function works by adding an event listener to restart. Remember, restart is just our actual restart button. So I will say restart, add event listener, and upon a click, it's going to call the function clear board. So let's save this. And right now I have an X in there, so I will refresh the page. It's blank right now, so if I click restart, I'm not going to see any difference. So I will come back to my main HTML and add something to one of these cells. Let's give it an X, refresh my page. I see that X now. If I click restart, it was cleared. So it looks like everything's working. So I'm going to come back here and then clear this so we can refresh this page. So far we have a function that successfully loops through every cell in the table and clears it, makes its text content nothing. Alright, now we've reached what's probably the most challenging part of this project, which is getting the board to display X's and O's or blanks depending on if we click on a cell. So how can we actually do this? Well, the way you could probably do it, given what you know so far, is to come back to this HTML file, give each cell a specific ID, and then come back to JavaScript and add event listeners for each particular ID, checking to see if it's in blank, X, or O, and then changing the marker depending on where it's been clicked. So that's one way of doing it. The official solutions have a way that uses the JavaScript this keyword that is used in a way we haven't seen before. So I'm going to show you first the solution that you have the capability to come up with on your own. However, it's repetitive. Then after that, I'll show you the solution that's more advanced and uses a this keyword, but is a little cleaner and uses a for loop. So let's start off with the most basic solution we can think of. And we'll just run it for one cell. I'm going to give this cell an ID of 1. And then coming back to my JavaScript, going to make some new lines for myself. And we're going to make a variable called cell1 and have it be equal to the document, query selector, and then we'll give it the ID of 1. And now we're going to say cell1. We'll add an event listener to it. So there's our event listener, and upon click, we'll have it do something. So we'll say function, and we'll grab cell1, and we'll say its text content is going to be equal to X. So this is the most basic way we could do this. Let me refresh the page and make sure this is actually working. So now, cell1, I click on it, it becomes X. If I hit restart, then it gets blank. So right now, if I click on it, it only turns X once. So let's add the functionality where it cycles through blank, X, and O. So we can add some logic here in order to make that happen. I'm going to say if cell1.textContent is equal to blank, remember that's how it starts off as, then cell1.textContent, set that equal to X. Else if cell1.textContent is equal to X, then I'm going to say cell1 text content becomes equal to O. And then else, what we're going to be doing here is setting it back equal to blank. So we'll say cell1 text content is equal to blank. So this should effectively cycle through X's and O's. And let's make sure we actually got the logic right here. If I see that the text content is blank, I'm going to set the text content to X. If when I click on it, I see that the current text content is X, well then it'll be set to 0 or O. And then if it's neither blank nor X, then it must be O, so I will cycle it back to being blank. Okay, let's save this and refresh, see if it works. So here I click on this, right now it's X, click on it again, it becomes O. Click on it one more time, and it's blank. Great. So this is what you have the capability and knowledge of doing right now. Technically, you then could have just copied and pasted this 8 more times and changed cell 1 to cell 2, cell 3, cell 4, etc. And that's how you could have solved this problem. Okay, so this is the solution you would have probably come up with, and you would have just copied and pasted this maybe 8 more times. And that's one way of doing it without using the this keyword. And that's one of the most basic ways of doing it. However, it really violates the dry principle of coding, which is don't repeat yourself. So what we're going to be doing is showing you how you can use the this keyword to do something really similar, except not have it be repeated so often. So I'm going to create a function, and I will call this function change marker. And it's essentially going to be a very generic version of what we just wrote. I'm going to say if, and then I'm going to use the this keyword, text content, is equal to x, is equal to blank. Then what I'll end up doing is saying this text content, and this should have been triple equal sign, and then we'll reset this to be x. Then we'll have an else if, and this is going to say if this text content is equal to x, then I'm going to set this text content equal to O. And then else, if that's the case, then I'm going to say this text content and set it back equal to being blank. All right, so that's the most generic version of this, and it's using the this keyword. And this is inside of a function, which we haven't really seen before. We've only seen the this keyword inside a method inside an object, but a function is pretty similar to a method, so hopefully this is making sense to you so far, especially since we just ran the more specific version of this. This is basically the generic version. So what we need to do is add this as an event listener for all the squares. So I will say for, and then I will, again, loop through squares. And then I'm going to say dot add an events listener. And upon click, I'm going to call change marker. And now let's refresh our page and see if this works. So it's working on the first one, and now I can see it's working on any of them. So this is the tic-tac-toe project, and that's really all you had to do. And now when I click restart, it gets cleared. That's the most generic version of solving that issue of X's and O's. Would I have expected you to solve this on your own with this solution? Maybe, probably not. It's a little more advanced, and it's a little beyond the scope of what we covered in the sections of the course about JavaScript, but don't worry, in the next section, we're going to be covering jQuery, which is going to give you the skills to naturally come up with a much smoother and better way of accessing document object model material or properties. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the project. Thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture.